Please join me in giving Ms. Pramila Jayapal a warm FDIC welcome.
Thank you so much. Is that on? Can you hear me? Great. How are you all doing today? It's great to be here with you, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to actually stand in front of you today. Thank you so much for the introduction, Vijay. I was born in Madras, India, which is now called Chennai. And when I was 4 years old, my family moved to Indonesia. This was in 1969. And I spent most of my high school years in Indonesia. When I graduated high school, I was 16 years old, and my parents took all of the savings that they had left, which was about $5,000. It was a huge amount of money that they had spent years working to save. And they used that to send me here to college in the United States. And they did that because they believed that America was the place where I would have the brightest future and the best education. I think about that sometimes now because I'm the mother of a 16-year-old. And I think about what it would be like to send my son across the ocean to a country knowing that he might never come back. And I think about the emotional and financial sacrifices that my parents made and parents of so many others who have sent their children here to the United States. And I'm eternally, eternally grateful for those sacrifices. And I still remember small things about when I arrived in the United States. I had been here once before for a very, very short period of time, but for all intents and purposes, it was my first time. It was 1982, and I remember arriving at JFK Airport. And these are small memories that I think no matter how long you go, they don't leave you. And I remember being amazed at how big it was. And I remember watching a couple hugging and kissing in the airport. And even though I went to an international school in Indonesia, where I grew up, public displays of affection on the street were not really accepted. And I remember thinking how strange that was. I arrived at Georgetown, where I went to college, and I really didn't know so many things. In spite of having gone to an international school with a lot of Americans, I didn't know what clothes to wear in the winter. I didn't know if your collars stayed inside the sweater or outside the sweater. My feet broke out in rashes because I wasn't used to wearing socks. And I didn't know what the references to pop culture meant. I would try to use a lot of common phrases that I heard and I thought I knew, only to find out that they were completely wrong. I don't know how many of you know the phrase, well, I thought the phrase was, it's a dog-eat-dog world. You know, like a really doggy world, the worst of dogs. And it was years before I figured out, not until I was in graduate school, actually, when I said, it's just been a dog-eat-dog day in a dog-eat-dog world. And somebody said, what kind of a world? And I said, dog-eat-dog. And it only then was revealed to me that it was actually a dog-eat-dog world. And if you too didn't know that, I'm happy to share that with you today. But I remember playing in the snow with my freshman year with a friend of mine who was from New Orleans, Louisiana, also hadn't seen snow before. And we ran outside to catch snowflakes on our tongues and make angels in the snow. And it never occurred to us to wear coats or mittens or socks because we had no idea how cold snow would be. And we only had enough money. My family only had enough money for me to call home once a year. And so I remember my sophomore year being at the college dorm hall phone, and using that call to tell my father that I no longer wanted to be an economics major, I wanted to be an English literature major. And then holding the phone like this as he yelled at me and said, I didn't send you to America to learn to speak English, you already speak English. Because you see, my father's dream for me was that I would be the CEO of IBM. To him, IBM was the cultural icon of success. It was a symbol of American success. IBM was everywhere in Asia at that time, and my dad believed that his two daughters could do anything, could climb anywhere that we wanted to go. And if I wasn't going to be the CEO of IBM, then his dream for me was really that I would be a doctor or a lawyer or a business professional, something that would give me the kind of security and safety that he had worked so hard all of his life to get. So Vijay did not mention, but probably wasn't in his life plan for me that I would do civil disobedience in the streets for the issues that I care about. and even get arrested because I felt it was so important to draw attention to the issues I work on. But I did follow the path that he laid out for me for a while. And I tried to become the all-American icon that he imagined. I wore what I saw other people wearing. I tried to act like others. I obviously already spoke good English, but I even learned to imitate the accents of Americans that I was talking to. So come and find me later and see if I can do this for your accent. I did well in school, and I went on to work for an investment bank on Wall Street. And this was in the mid-1980s when Mike Milken was king and junk bonds were sort of the it girl in town. And that was, I think at that time I was one of very few women and even fewer people of color that were on Wall Street in those jobs. And so it was very common for me to often be the only person of color, the only woman of color, certainly, in the many rooms I was on. And I stayed on that path, and I even went on to get my master's in business. But the more I saw, the more I wondered. The more I looked around, the more I was confronted by persistent inequality. There was, of course, flagrant discrimination and inequality within the business world, but more than that, I saw broken systems and poor people without a voice. I saw immigrants and Black people and white people who wanted more for themselves, for their families, and for their communities. I saw that I could climb higher and higher and be a novelty, a single brown woman in a sea of white faces, or I could actually work to fix the structures so that everyone could have real opportunities and real choices for their lives. I saw that I could do something more American than anything I had ever imagined, which was to work to create a more perfect union. And so in 1991, I left the private sector and I started working full-time for social justice, thinking about how we create a stronger and more equitable society and community where all of us, regardless of the color of our skin or where we came from or what we look like, feel valued for who we are and what we bring with us. Nowhere is this more important than right here in America, in this place that is the world's greatest experiment in multicultural democracy. And at no time has this been as important as today in a world of migration, immigration, and movement. Today, 1 billion people across the world are on the move, and an estimated 214 million people live in a country other than the one in which we were born. Right here in the United States, we have the world's largest share of immigrants in the world. That is 33 million people, or 20% of the world's migrant population lives right here within the United States borders. So I'm one of those people. How about you? Who else was born in another country? Can you stand up? If you were born in another country and you live here now, can you stand up? Tell me just yell out the countries that you came from. Ecuador, Salvador, Philippines, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Japan. Wonderful, Taiwan. Okay, stay standing, don't sit down. Sorry, this is the exercise for the day. Yeah, you can applaud for them, why not? Okay, how many of you have parents that were born somewhere else? How many of you have parents that were born in another country? Please stand up. Stand up. Great. And how many of you had grandparents or some other generation in your past that came from another country? Please stand up. Grandparents or... Yes, it's a bit of a trick question. So if you're seated still, then you should be 100% Native American. Right? So let's give ourselves a round of applause. Because willing or unwilling immigrants brought over on slave ships or crossing the border to escape persecution, the reality is that almost all of us came from somewhere else at one time. As the great civil rights legend said to me when I was organizing the Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride back in 2003, Reverend Joseph Lowery, he said, "We may have come over here on different ships, but we're all in the same damn boat now." Am I allowed to say that word here at the FDIC? Okay. It is a technical term. And anyway, it was Reverend Lowery's term. So my friend Beth, who's a Filipina American, likes to say that we immigrants live in the hyphen. We live in the space between the places that we come from and the places that we go. We live in the space of change, because if there's one thing that's true about migration, it is that everybody and everything that's touched by it changes. We are a global people of movement, even fueling migration through our foreign policy decisions and our trade decisions. And while we embrace the free flow of goods and capital and ideas, we struggle with how to embrace each other for who we are. We restrict the free flow of people. We solidify concepts of physical borders, spending billions to build stronger fences and walls, even though we know that fences and walls have never stopped people in search of dreams, in search of refuge, in search of livelihoods. So I want to say to you that the issue of immigration has never just been about immigration. It has always been about what kind of a country we want to be and what we're willing to stand up for. Immigration policy in America has actually been one of the last remaining systems that we actually allow to be racially discriminatory. We brought over African slaves who tilled our plantations, Chinese laborers who built our railroads, and even Polish and Irish immigrants who started businesses and built new communities. And those immigrants, just like today's immigrants, had to contend with the idea that they were welcomed as long as they didn't have power, as long as they were doing what we asked them to do, and not more, then things were just fine. But the minute they started demanding rights and inclusion and power, the minute they started demanding that they be seen and heard, then everything changed. Then the resistance started. And so today in America, we have another chance to move our country forward, to fix our broken system, and to liberate millions of immigrants to contribute their full selves to this country that they now call home. If immigrants live in the spaces in between, in the world between becoming and being, in that hyphen, then immigrants aren't the problem. As America becomes more multicultural and global, immigrants actually hold the key. Immigrants light that path to a solution. And polling tells us actually that the majority of Americans know that our immigration policy is broken. They know that 4.5, or maybe they don't know this, but they know it's broken in many ways. 4.5 million people waiting in a legal immigration backlog that have legally sponsored their immediate family members to come here, who have been waiting decades to get them here. 12 million people who are undocumented, who work in the shadows every day, picking our vegetables, cleaning our hotel rooms, looking after our kids and our elderly, and afraid as they go out every morning that this may be the last day that they see their kids because they may get deported. Workers who clearly see that their work is needed in the United States, but unable to be openly proud of what they do to build this country. Muslims who, simply because of their religion, have been blackballed in national security checks that have no end, afraid to even be spectators at a marathon like everyone else, because if they run from the bomb blast, then they might be questioned. We can herald this country as a land of immigrants. We can make allusions to the Statue of Liberty, but unless we actually fix the policy that keeps people down, keeps wages low, and excludes people from having any power in this land that we call a democracy, we failed. And so in so many ways, immigration has at its core the topic of this speech, which is embracing cultures and inclusion and building leadership. These aren't theoretical questions. They're not theoretical. They're actually real questions. The challenges are great, yes, but the promises, the opportunities, the hopes and the dreams, that's why so many people come to America, because we are trying and working every day to create that more perfect union. It is that dream, that hope, that opportunity that has had me devote my life to being an immigrant and civil rights and human rights activist, to ensuring that people everywhere, regardless of what they look like, can contribute their voices and their skills, their ideas, their full selves to this country. And let's be clear that our past and our present experiments have seen many challenges, many setbacks, many injustices. When 9/11 happened, we saw history start to repeat itself. We saw fear and patriotism come together to try to suppress dissent. It is one of the most effective ways to suppress dissent, is to combine fear and patriotism. And we saw the superficial trappings of what we call our pride and diversity slip away. We saw people with turbans and brown skin put on trial, literally and figuratively, for the color of their skin, their religion, and their country of origin. In those days after 9/11, when I first started the organization that I ran and grew into one of the largest immigrant and human rights organizations in the country, Japanese Americans were actually some of the first people to speak out against the secret detentions and deportations of Arabs and Muslims that were happening by the US government because they remembered their own experience. They remembered one day being American and the next day being one of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were put into internment camps. They remembered what it felt like to have their patriotism and their Americanism questioned. They remembered suddenly going from being one of us to being one of them. After 9/11, many of us had to show that we were American enough. I actually stopped wearing Indian clothes outside of my house. Sikh Americans had to go against their very religions, cut their beards, and not wear turbans, just so they would look more American. Immigrant cab drivers put up American flags and wore patriotic t-shirts. Many of us, me included, were told to go home, back to our own country, even though we had lived more than half of our lives in America, planted roots, grown dreams, built families and communities. It still makes me emotional to think about it. Many of us had to fight the US government itself to not racially profile us and to remind people, to remind America that the thing that is so great about this country is that it is built on core ideas of rights and liberties and due process. And now, most recently, we continue to grapple with what it really means to build diverse leadership at all levels. As the US Supreme Court gets ready to debate challenges to affirmative action, the New York Times recently wrote about the slow progress of Blacks in America. Little more than 1% of the nation's 500 companies have Black chief executives. The share of Black doctors and dentists hasn't grown since 1990. And it's not just about the numbers, but about the subtle and not so subtle ways in which people of color are often left out because they don't have the same networks or meet the same cultural cues. And the article also revealed, which wasn't a surprise to those of us who are on the ground working with regular folks every day, that during the recession, people of color were laid off at higher rates than white folks. And all of a sudden, businesses decided to make diversity less of a priority, just like that. And so in all these situations, 9/11, the internment, affirmative action, as different as each one of those things are from each other, we see the ways in which valuing diversity can slip so quickly to reveal implicit biases that exist within all of us, that are threaded through the systems that we work with and rely upon every day. And it's a reminder to us that if we are going to be part of writing a new American future, we have a lot of work to do. And so now more than ever, we, which means all of you and me and everyone else, have to define what American means. We're at a crossroads here in America. As a society, Vijay talked about this, we're younger, we're browner, we're blacker, we're multicultural, we come from many races, we speak many languages. And just imagine this, by 2025, the Hispanic population will grow by the equivalent of the population of the entire state of California. The entire state of California. And Asians, we're going to grow by the population of the entire state of Pennsylvania. Well, by 2025, white folks will have peaked at about 200 million people, down to about 60% of the country's population. And then we'll start to decline from there as baby boomers see their last days. So we are, and we will continue to be, a very different America than we have been in the past. Back in 2009, our Attorney General, Eric Holder, said something that was seen as very controversial. He said, "Though this nation has proudly thought of itself as an ethnic melting pot, in things racial, we have always been, and I believe continue to be, in too many ways, essentially a nation of cowards." He went on to say that race issues continue to be topics of political discussion, but, and I'm quoting him again, "we as average Americans simply do not talk with each other enough about race." And that was a controversial speech because people do not like to be called cowards. Who likes to be called a coward, right? None of us want to be called cowards. And when talking about race, just about everything is often heard in a way that sometimes reinforces negative and racist perceptions, that digs people into the view that they have in a way that doesn't necessarily help move our conversation forward. And yet, Eric Holder was right. We need to talk about race. We need to talk about the ways in which the country is changing. And ignoring that it's changing, or fighting that it's changing, or saying it's not really changing, you're just imagining it, that's not going to help us. The truth is that the issues that come up around race, around immigrants, around people who are different, I believe, are often rooted in fear. And often it's a legitimate fear. It's not an irrational fear. It is a legitimate fear if you look at it in certain ways. The fear that if there are more people, there will be less for me. The fear that I won't have a job anymore. The fear that my culture is going to change and I'm not going to fit in anymore. The fear that, hey, I kind of like being in the majority. I don't really want to be in the minority, right? These are fears that we need to talk about because we all have them to one degree or another. And we need tools to help us navigate these changes. We need conversations about what it looks like to be different. We need to talk about structural power. We need to talk about how we're all going to have to change if this greatest experiment in multicultural democracy is actually going to work. We're going to have to figure out how the systems that we built to serve a very different population 30 or 40 years ago are going to have to change to serve this new population. What kinds of educational systems do we need to have in order to educate this multicultural and multilingual population? What kinds of jobs work in this new global economy? How do our programs and our services and our benefits, including the ones that you provide, the very important ones you provide right here at the FDIC, how do they change so that they meet the needs of a very different population who gets and consumes and absorbs information in very different ways, and ultimately who leads and designs those programs so they can succeed? So if we want this to happen, I'm going to propose to you that we actually have to examine where we are on a spectrum. And that spectrum goes from exclusion at this end to tolerance, to diversity, to love. So let's talk about those terms. We know what we mean by exclusion, right? I mean, we know about exclusion in the law, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was signed into law in 1882 and stayed in place until 1943. And even then, only allowed 105 Chinese people to immigrate every year until 1965, which was the year that I was born. That was when that quota was taken away. And my people from India faced the exact same issues. There were only 105 of us allowed. And we weren't allowed to intermarry, in spite of the fact that we were contributing our labor to this country. But it's not just about color of skin, because you might remember that even when the Irish and the Polish came in, they were called too black to belong. And that tells us something, right, about what black means in this country. And certainly nobody knows about exclusion better than Native Americans and African Americans. Exclusion from lands, exclusion from voting, and exclusion from even being whole people. So on my spectrum, you have to travel a really long way to go from exclusion to the next place that I want to talk about, which is the place of tolerance. And that movement forward is good. But when I say tolerate, I don't know about you, but I think about a pesky younger brother or sister. I think about tolerating the person that I don't really like, but I know I have to sort of be around. I think about tolerating abuse or bullying because I don't know what to do about it. Tolerance for me is a word that immediately draws a distinction between us and them and implies a certain power. I don't really like the people I tolerate, and I don't really believe deep down that they have anything to offer me. I just allow them to be here because I have to, but that's it. So let's leave tolerance and let's move down the spectrum to diversity. Diversity includes all of the ways in which people differ, and it encompasses all of the different characteristics that make an individual or group different from one another. It's all-inclusive, and it recognizes that everyone and every group as part of diversity should be valued. So it's not just about race and ethnicity and gender, which are the things we normally talk about when we talk about diversity, but also obviously age, national origin, religion, you get the picture. And it also involves different ideas, perspectives, and values. And the belief that diversity makes us stronger is inherently a beautiful proposition, a proposition that is very far from tolerance and even further from exclusion. But diversity loses its strength when it becomes a goal in and of itself, or even when it becomes a distraction. And what I mean by that is too often, diversity has become a way to say, hey, we've got some Asian folks, and we've got some Latinos, and we've got a few Black people, and we've got some women, and, check, we're done, right? And by the way, don't look at the rainbow of people that we have, and don't look at the policies and the structures that exist, right, within our organizations or our communities or our societies. And I'll tell you that something I've had happen to me very often is I'm invited to a room that's not that diverse, maybe all white, maybe all male. And by the way, we love you, all white, all male people. This is not about saying that there's not something good there, like everything. But I'll be invited to a room and somebody will say something to me like, Pramila, it's so great to have you here. You're just the kind of person we need because you will fit right in. Has anybody ever had that happen in some way or another, right? Somebody say something like that. I see some heads nodding. So that makes me really worried. It really makes me worried because you know what? I'm not here to fit in. I'm actually here to offer my diversity, my lived experience, my ideas, my insights, and my leadership. That's why I want you to be happy to have me in the room. So diversity without attention to the structures within can actually do more harm than good by perpetuating stereotypes and myths of the roles of different people. So on my spectrum, we've now made it to equity. And equity, we know, is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, advancement for everyone, while at the same time working to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented historically underrepresented and underserved populations from having the same opportunities. And so that notion of equity also recognizes that we need different kinds of people to design the structures and the programs that we have. And equity is often about shifting the balance of power that exists, of making that power more equitable. And equity is what we have to address in America if we're going to have this multicultural experiment succeed. Because when you have an unequal society, you have not addressed equity. You have not addressed equity when you have a society where prisons are being built based on the third grade test scores, failure rates of Black and brown kids. That is how they define where a prison is going to be built. You do not have equity when you have a society where 22% of people younger than 35 are in poverty, and only 38% of older Americans say that they have enough income to last through retirement. So in the last few years, we've seen our collective desire to diversify home ownership and diversify bundles of toxic investment products crumble because that desire was built on the shaky ground of inequity. The homeowner that was scrimping and saving, even in a good economy, to be able to afford what turned into a ballooning bad mortgage, didn't have the same purchasing power, let alone negotiating power of upper middle class homeowners. They didn't have the right information, and often they were just pawns in a larger system that wanted to put more debt into the economy, regardless of whether somebody could pay it back or not. And incidentally, a lot of people were gambling on getting rich, actually based on that inequity. And so we all learned a lesson that inequities that are so prominent in boom times can virtually disappear in the bust. Millions of formerly middle-class Americans now know that they were only decorative tokens in the American dream. And right here at the FDIC, you deal with the unbankable. You deal with issues of inequity and equity. And in that report that I read that was so good, I learned from the statistics. Let me say, I know from personal experience some of these people, but I learned that 8.2% of U.S. households are unbanked, and that in fact, while 10% don't have a checking account, nearly 30% lack access to a savings account. You know all of this, and you know what it means in practical terms, is that without a bank account, I can't get loans, I can't get credit, I can't buy a car, I can't buy a house, and I can't even make it through a medical illness. I remember one day, one of the people that I work with, a woman named Maria from Mexico, came to my house. She was one of our members, and she had a brown paper bag with $50,000 in it. And she was escaping an abusive husband. And she was in a panic because she had kept all of that money at home because she didn't know where else to put it. And it was so important to her. She had spent 15 years working 14-hour days as a housekeeper. to build up that savings of $50,000 so she could send it home, so she could send money home for her kid to be educated, to get a graduate degree. That was her dream, and to ultimately be able to buy a house. And she gave me the paper bag and said, will you keep this in your underwear drawer or your sock drawer where nobody will find it? And you know what? I did for a couple of days until it was terrifying, until I could talk to her about why she needed to open a bank account. But she was so afraid because she was undocumented and she didn't trust the banks. So our job is to reach people like her, to change our structures and our systems so we can get to people like Maria. So equity is about a struggle. It's about a struggle to right structural wrongs and conditions that keep people down and away from contributing their full selves. As Frederick Douglass said, power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And so that's where the last part of this comes into play. So we've got exclusion on one end of the spectrum, and what's on the other end? It's not actually inclusion, which is in the title of what I'm supposed to talk about today, but I believe it's actually love. And it may seem really funny to say it's all about love here at the FDIC, but really, that's what we're talking about. And that's what we need to remember as human beings who are so deeply connected on very fundamental levels to each other. Cornel West likes to say that justice is what love looks like in public. Isn't that beautiful? Justice is what love looks like in public. So right now, there are people out there who have decided, and I actually don't believe it's any of you because you came to hear the speech, but there are people out there who believe and who have decided that hate is actually going to defeat love and justice. They've decided that an us versus them framework is the best way to divide and make sure that they continue to have power. So they try to have us think that difference is dangerous, that if someone is winning, then someone else is losing, and that it's us versus them, and the us is a giant teeming mass of brown and black people who commit crimes or prey on our taxes or pray to a false god. But that argument, this is the thing I want to propose to you, that argument only wins as long as we let it win. As long as we're nervous to talk about race or immigration or economic justice as an integral part of our vision, we let that divisive narrative win. And that's where love comes into play. If we don't full-throatedly and full-heartedly embrace each other and build leadership that is accessible to all, take care of each other, love each other, we let the other side win. Love is premised on our collective welfare. It does not distinguish between yours and mine and who's getting ahead. It recognizes that the real truth is that nobody gets ahead. We either all get dragged down or we all get lifted up. Love recognizes that the best innovation, the best creativity, the best solutions come from a place of generosity and abundance, not from a place of scarcity and fear. So, if you want to move on the spectrum from exclusion to love, we need leadership. We need your leadership. And perhaps the most rewarding part of my work has been the ability to bring forward so many different parts of leadership, so many different kinds of leadership, and watch that transformation happen as regular people feel recognized and seen for the contributions and skills that they bring. We used to say that we don't create leaders in my work. We don't create leaders. We create the spaces that allow ordinary people to do extraordinary things. We create the spaces for leaders to emerge because they're given the space, the encouragement, the support, and the urgency to do so. So we have an opportunity to write the future of this country. We have an opportunity to draw a picture of an economic, racial, and social justice system that gets us back to the core of who we are. A country born of hope and possibility for those who were most oppressed. A country that believed in the form of government that would be by the people, for the people, and of the people. For the people. That means a government that has the money to take care of our roads and infrastructure, an education system that works, an environment that supports us, a government that recognizes that we're all better off if we're all better off. We have an opportunity to use our fear to transform ourselves, because it's often in feeling fear deep inside that courage is actually born. That's leadership. And when you push to make sure that your programs are actually reaching those who need it, that's leadership. When you get involved in writing an issue of injustice in your community, that's leadership. When you turn to the person next to you in the middle of the day when you're really busy and take the time to find out a little bit about where they're coming from, that too is leadership. And so I want you to do something now that's a little corny, but I am a little corny. And that is that I want you to look at the person next to you. They don't have to look at you, but if they want to, that's great. But look at the person next to you. He or she is a leader. And the person that they're looking at, which is you and you and you and you and you are all leaders. And you're the ones who are going to make a difference. Because being human is a courageous act. It is actually the only act that salvages our souls and builds the future. Not being afraid to be who we are, believing that we have something real to contribute, and then working together collectively to change the structures and the powers that keep us down, that is leadership. And that is the leadership that we need to move with the tide of change into the future, to write that future together, to remind ourselves of the incredible founding principles of this nation, that all men and women are created equal, endowed with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so what I'm asking of you today is your continued leadership, your continued work to reflect not only on diversity, but on equity, inclusion, and love, to take risks and say the things that nobody else is saying, to actually allow yourself to be contribute yourself fully to the space that you're in, and to bring forward the parts of you that don't really fit in, maybe to say things that push the comfort boundaries of the people around you. Because, as I said, this is a struggle, and struggle is never easy. So this is a choice that we all have to make. Choose courageously, fight inevitability, struggle for what you think is right, be yourself, and bring that full self to the table, and then create the space for others to do the same. Thanks for all that you do, and for all that I know you'll continue to do in building our loving America of the future. Thank you very much.